Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final and a very special edition of AviaDev Insight Africa's connectivity update for 2024. This is the podcast offering a deep dive into route development news in Africa. I'm your host, Jon Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa, a platform dedicated to supporting the development of air routes to, from, and within the African continent. Now, today, what we're going to be doing is looking back at the year, and my expert guests will be looking back through this year's activities and nominating their winners for different categories that we've come up with. However, to make it much more fun, there has been no conferring between my guests today. So they've made individual independent assessments, and they'll be putting those out on the air live, providing their reasoning and then debating with each other as to why they made the decision that they made over the next hour. As you would expect, for this episode being the end of the year, we welcome back our two main protagonists from the year, namely Chief Regional Troublemaker Jon Mendis, who will be doubtless delivering some knowledge and truth bombs during the course of the episode. Those of you, obviously, who are regular listeners do know this, but of course, Jon brings over 20 years of experience to the industry, including stints managing airports, commercial airlines, startups, and also cargo airlines in Africa and the Middle East. Our second guest, of course, is aviation and wildlife expert. I'm not sure which way round we should put that nowadays. Behramjee Ghadially, who is an aviation consultant with over 20 years of experience supporting airlines globally with their network planning and almost 10 years working in the African continent as well. So as always, because none of us know, Behramjee, go on.
Bangkok restaurant recommendations also.
Okay, so he's now a restaurant.
Master of Bangkok pizzas.
Okay, yeah. Bangkok, incredibly famous for its pizzas, and so I'm sure all our listeners will know. And that might tell you all you need to know about his culinary expertise. Maybe you should stick to the wildlife and the aviation. But anyway, we'll park that one for now, Behramjee. So yeah, just as always, of course, before we start, I have no idea what is going to be suggested today. So of course, the opinions of my guests are very much their own. But of course, you will hear that they are backed up by, I'm sure, very much compelling reasoning and statistics. So it's now time to fasten your seatbelts. We're going to start our taxi out. Welcome to the end of year Connectivity Update Awards for 2024. Okay, category 1, Intercontinental Route of the Year. Obviously, Africa has to be involved here. Behramjee, we're going to give you the serve. You have the ball, sir. You can serve and give us your nomination for Intercontinental Route of the Year.
Right. So I would nominate Air France's new service to Kilimanjaro and Zanzibar as my favored new intercontinental route of the year for Africa. It was, I would say, out of the box thinking for Air France, a much needed new service to Europe from Kilimanjaro. And it has been done due to the ever increasing tourism that has been coming from Europe and USA into Tanzania. The good thing is it was a low risk option because they were combining Zanzibar and Kilimanjaro on the same flight. So Europeans who like to do open jaw itineraries with tour operators, you mix the beach of Zanzibar and the safari of Kilimanjaro in itinerary. And that's what Air France has done with their triangle operation. And it has been using a low-risk aircraft for wide bodies, the modern A350. It's 350, right, Sean? Not a 787-9, right?
Yeah, 359, yeah.
Yes. So I would nominate that route as being my favored new intercontinental route of the year for 2024 for Africa. Number 2 is a personal favorite because of convenience. It's Royal Air Maroc to Toronto.
But we're not doing number 2s, Behramjee. You've already bent the rules here. It says Intercontinental Route of the Year, not route. Yeah, on the Air France. Yeah, that's great news. Obviously, Nicola and the network planning team will be with us in Zanzibar. Zanzibar was included in that route as well, which is very exciting as the host of AviaDev next year as well. So extra points for that one, Behramjee. Sean, over to you to nominate yours. And then obviously you can have some discussion with Behramjee.
I'm just going to have a bit of comment on Behramjee's. I think it was one of the routes I looked at, and while I think it's an excellent route, I don't think it quite qualifies on the top of the year because it was probably just so obvious. We've seen that so many, as we discussed, I think earlier in the year, that a lot of European airlines are looking at how to deploy their fleet better during the northern winter seasons, and routes like this to high-yield tourist destinations, such as safari destinations and the premium African beaches, as opposed to the bucket and spade flights to the Lanzarotes and the Alicantes and stuff of the world. These are just logical ways of doing it. So certainly, I don't disagree. It's an excellent route. I will stand back and say that, all right, we're not quite sure whether this qualifies as the best intercontinental route of the year to and from Africa, with all due respect to our friends at Air France. Now, when it comes to what my nominations are for this route, it's actually strange because I've really been struggling. And in fact, I've even got two written down here, and I've got to decide which one of these two is going to be the one that I choose as my choice for the year. Ironically, both of these are from airlines that most of our listeners think that I give an extremely hard time to all through the year. Some of the people in charge of these routes at those airlines themselves have called me their enemy. Worst, but enemy is about the worst I can mention on this podcast. But my two choices were South African Airways from Johannesburg to Perth and Air Peace from London to Lagos. And quite honestly, these two are both routes that to me seemed screamingly obvious, but also had challenges enough because they're somewhat secondary. And the market between South Africa and Australia is humongous, and it continues to grow, and there continues to be a battle in that space. We've covered it when SAA launched their flights. We've covered even the Singapore Airlines increase in capacity in South Africa, which is largely being driven by Australia traffic. We've discussed Qantas when they brought in their A380 into Johannesburg this year. We've discussed this market throughout, but so much of the Australia market tends to be focused on the East Coast. And Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, they seem to get 90% of the attention. Perth is the forgotten stepchild. Yet, when we look at the numbers in terms of Eastern and Southern Africa primarily into Australia, we find that when you add up all those markets together, there is as much of a market to Perth as there is to Melbourne. And, South Africa and Zimbabwe in particular, those markets have a huge amount of VFR traffic, first generation expatriates who've moved over from South Africa and Zimbabwe into Western Australia in particular, whether it's mining, whether it's aviation, and a whole range of other industries, which also have the business links. So that kind of market was screaming for direct service. That direct service shaves many hours off an indirect route, which used to go via Singapore or via the Middle East or elsewhere. And I think that route was an absolute no-brainer. The other contender I had in my top list was another one that just, again, is so glaringly obvious, which is Lagos to London, Gatwick on Air Peace. And London is a market from Lagos that is London to Nigeria is in the 750,000 passengers a year range. Yet the bilateral agreements between Nigeria and the UK limit the number of flights that can be flown to just 21 flights per week on each side. Now, the UK side is using all 21 of those frequencies. Virgin Atlantic flies daily to Lagos, British Airways flies daily to Lagos, and British Airways flies daily to Abuja. Consequently, that's a few 100,000 of it, but over 50% of the market was being forced to take indirect carriers, whether that's going to be via Amsterdam on KLM or via Dubai. Dubai wasn't an option earlier in the year, but via Doha or via Istanbul or via pretty much anywhere else other than directly. And for all the criticism I have of Air Peace, this was a route, when they opened it in March, I said, this is going to be a route that they're going to really have to work hard to screw up. And by all accounts, it seems they have gone from strength to strength. They started this off with a mixture of their own 777s and a wet lease Norse 787 that grew to their own 777 on every frequency. And now they're flying their own 777-300s. So an increase in capacity as well. And they've received fairly decent reviews, especially relative to the rest of their network, which still gets rather dire reviews from various consumers and everything else. So they're running this route relatively operationally stably. They've done a decent job in marketing it. You can't go on Instagram right now without seeing some influencer or the other talking about the jollof they got on that route or similar. They're introducing a first-class product now there as well, which I'm not quite sure if I agree with that aspect of it, but there's enough Nigerians with money to waste, and that may be something that makes sense for them. So it's definitely two airlines, which I think a lot of our people will be wondering, did I just hear Sean praise South African Airways and Air Peace? But of the two of them, I'm going to go ahead and say South African Airways is my number one. And the reason for this is Air Peace should have actually done this a really long time ago. They've had their 777 sitting around for 7 years. And for those 7 years, their CEO and their team have looked for every excuse for why they were picking routes that subsequently failed. Air Peace was an airline of excuses rather than an airline of success and reasons. This is the first route they've actually picked, which sort of makes sense. And even a stop clock is right twice a day. And I think this may be one of those things rather than give Air Peace any sort of credit for it. South African Airways, on the other hand, they were in a tough situation when they came out of their business rescue. They had a legacy fleet that they had to figure out how to deploy. They had to figure out legacy markets, how they were going to re-enter some of these markets. And very smartly for them, they took the wide body lift that they had, which was A330s and A340s, and rather than deploying them on loss-making but more glamorous routes into Europe, into North America, and so forth, they built a wide body network of routes that could deliver results, if not on day one, but very quickly. So they started flying to Sao Paulo from Johannesburg and Cape Town. Again, Sao Paulo made sense. Johannesburg and Cape Town split operations didn't. They flew to Accra, they flew to Lagos, and then they flew to Perth. So overall, I'm going to say SAA in general, for how they handle the Johannesburg to Perth, this route has done well as well. They're increasing it now up to 5 times a week, I believe, in January. So that's next month, now that they have their second A340 back. And it's going to go from strength to strength. So that is my nominee for Best Intercontinental Route of the Year, to from Africa, South African Airways, Johannesburg to Perth.
Fantastic. And great that both of your top two, again, bit of license, but I think you explained them quite well, were both African carriers. So that was quite nice. That gives an extra point from my side. Slightly upset that Istanbul and Turkey wasn't involved simply because of my headgear if you're watching on YouTube, but that is the way it is. It is a turkey, not a chicken, just to clarify. Behramjee, your thoughts on Sean's pick, and then we'll go to the second category.
I would say what Sean said about Air Peace starting London is very true, because there were a lot of hurdles put in front of Air Peace for their London launch by many quarters, both internally within Nigeria and externally from outside Nigeria. So it was good to see that they ended up passing the finish line and launching the route, even though they started off with a wet-leased aircraft. But that even Arik Air did the same thing about 15 years ago. They started using the wet-leased A340-500, which was put under Hi-Fly's registration, and then it got moved to Arik Air when Arik Air started flying the A330-200s. But the good thing is, as Sean mentioned, Lagos, London in particular, has infinite demand, point to point in particular. More than half the passengers travel one stop via XYZ gateway. The market desperately needed another non-stop service. It can even accommodate another daily non-stop service if another Nigerian airline wanted to fly. We're using a wide-body aircraft. I would agree with the Lagos-London choice. However, Sean missed out one point. There was actually, I think, Air Peace's first relatively successful wide-body service was Kano to Jeddah, if I'm not mistaken. With the 777 since November 2023. It was Lagos.
You're very pleased with yourself with that one, aren't you, Behramjee? I can see it. We can see it on your face. All right. Awesome. Thank you guys for that first one. Let's move on to the second category. So we've got a few to get through. So this is the Intra-Africa route of the year. And we're going to let Sean start with this. So Sean, over to you.
Okay. Now for this one, people are going to be not surprised about which airline I picked, but they're going to be extremely surprised by the choice of route that I've chosen for that airline. Just from that idea, I think it's fairly obvious that the airline I'm going to pick is Ethiopian, because anything to do with Intra-Africa, if it's not Ethiopian, then what are you talking about? But my choice for the top Ethiopian Airlines intra-African route of the year and the top intra-African new route of the year is a really vague one, and that's Addis Ababa to Port Sudan.
Ah,
And I know this
right.
sounds like the weirdest one out there, but this is one of those situations where you can really see that this is what a flexibility, versatility, and timeliness has to do. There are no numbers. If you look at the numbers in this market, what are the numbers from Addis to Port Sudan? The answer was probably zero. There is no actual figures for what this market was in previous years, because this market was never served in previous years. But given the situation in Sudan, with the civil war over there, the closure of Khartoum, and the need of the Sudanese diaspora all over the world to travel to and from Sudan for a million different reasons, this became a vital link for Sudan to get to the world. Because the rest of the time, if you're trying to get to and from Sudan, you're not flying on network carriers. You're not flying on carriers who have a global network that can take you on a single ticket from New York or Chicago or London or Bangkok or India or wherever else. There is nothing. You're flying on I won't say two-bit airlines, but on airlines that most people have not heard of and which are operating in high-risk conflict zones. Ethiopian took the decision that they're going to go back into Sudan, and certainly they're making a huge amount of money from it. Flights are not cheap to and from Port Sudan, but it shows both from a corporate responsibility standpoint, that Sudan being a very key market of theirs, Sudan being a neighbor to Ethiopia, obviously having a major stake in serving that region and being dominant in that region, that they were willing to go ahead and take a risk that so many other airlines who pulled out of Sudan were not willing to consider Port Sudan as an alternative. And certainly they leveraged their geographic location. Addis to Port Sudan is less than 2 hours. So it's not they're flying 6, 7, 8 hours at this huge risk to operate these flights. But these flights seem to have done extremely well, at least financially. And I think just in terms of what it shows, and it reminds me back to something that Tewolde said, something that I said during COVID, that, airlines are not just there to make money necessarily. You're making money in the long term, but you're making money by being a good corporate citizen. And being a good corporate citizen sometimes pays off quicker than you might think. And I sincerely believe that this Ethiopian route to Port Sudan, completely out of the box, completely surprising to everybody who saw it, but completely making sense once you think about it and say, yeah, that makes sense. And I really hope that they're successful in that route, whether for the long term or until Khartoum comes back online. But Ethiopian to Port Sudan is my intra-African route of the year 2024.
Fantastic. Behramjee, your thoughts and then your nomination, please.
I was not expecting Sean to say that. Also, I had forgotten about the Ethiopian Port Sudan resumption, to be fair. But I just quickly checked whilst Sean was talking. So they are flying a daily 737 MAX 8 on that route from the onset, which, as Sean correctly put, sometimes numbers cannot be attributed to a business case, but some initiative and common sense and the willingness to expand into a market where you have virtual monopoly service, which adds to the yields and to the demand, because there's literally no other option to get out of Sudan. The Ethiopian Airlines schedule into Port Sudan is a 11:30 departure from Addis Ababa, which means all the European and Asian flights connect within 4 hours, 4.5 hours. It arrives back into Addis by 5:30 in the evening, which means again, within 4 to 5 hours, all the Asian and European flights also connect. So basically, as well as a lot of Intra-Africa, the overnight banks of Ethiopian Intra-Africa. So it covers all their bases quite nicely, and it's using a medium-sized aircraft, the 737 MAX 8. So they can even carry 4 tons of cargo in the belly when the country needs some emergency supplies. Yes, I'm sure the yields must be good because they have a virtual monopoly on that route. I would say definitely a very out-of-the-box nomination by Sean, and a very good one also.
So what about you? What's yours?
So mine is, I would say 2, but I would say the first one would be Egypt Air to Mogadishu. Egypt Air started flying to Mogadishu during the summer, twice a week via Djibouti. The good thing is that flight connects London in both directions. And that is the key thing, because the largest expat Somali community is in London. And it basically serves Egypt Air's network feed nicely, connects few other destinations in the Middle East as well in both directions, but it's only a twice a week service. And Somalia, especially the Somaliland area, it's now steadily growing economically. The expats, the Somali immigrants based abroad, they're starting to enter into new business ventures over there as situation improves on the ground. So I believe that should help Egypt Air's network feed as well as their overall African presence. The second route, which I would say is a tie, but I would say the Egypt Air one a little bit better, is Kenya Airways resumption to Maputo. The reason why I said that, because that's another niche route for an airline like Kenya Airways. They're using a very low risk aircraft, the Embraer E90 on that route. And Maputo has the high yield demand of the oil and gas. It feeds their European banks nicely. And Maputo is not well connected apart from Ethiopian Airlines. And if you take a South African to Johannesburg, then another airline elsewhere. So Kenya Airways gives the passengers flying to Maputo an extra choice for intercontinental connectivity. And again, using an Embraer E90 is absolutely low risk instead of using a 737-800. They might have some times payload issues if the flight is full with the two-piece baggage allowance. But other than that, I don't see that being a problem always. But yeah, I would say those two routes would be mine for Intra-Africa, new route of the year 2024.
Fantastic. Sean, your thoughts on those?
Interesting choices. I think the Egypt Air to Mogadishu is not something I would even consider putting in my top list. When it launched, I viewed it as a political route. We know that there is a bit of a love triangle going on between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Somalia right now over various affiliations and non-aviation politics. So I viewed it more in terms of Egypt wanting to stick a finger in Ethiopia's eye, saying, we're going to fly into this. Yes, there's going to be demand from Somalia to Europe. I think the Mogadishu market is getting a bit saturated right now. I think there are so many flights from so many different places. I did consider a Mogadishu route actually for route of the year 2024, but unfortunately it's been shut down. It started and ended in 2024, and that was Kenya Airways to Mogadishu. And it was something that Martin touted with us back this year with much fanfare that KQ was going to go into Mog. And then very quietly, with their tails between their legs, retreated from it just a few weeks ago. And the reason was nothing to do with commercials. The flight did well. The problem was operational challenges. For safety reasons, Kenya Airways was being restricted to operating only on runway 05 to and from on landings into Mogadishu. And consequently, they were having a lot of situations where aircraft were unable to land because of prevailing winds. And they were not keen on using runway 23 because that approach comes in over the city. So it was an operational decision, which unfortunately, end result was no KQ into Mogadishu anymore. And yeah, that would have been my choice of a route to and from Mogadishu. But your other choice, KQ to Maputo, can't go wrong with it. We discussed it significantly with Martin, away from Martin, and everything else. Look, intra-African connectivity is important. Nairobi, despite KQ's woes and challenges over the last few years, Nairobi remains probably, if not the number 2 hub in the region, definitely in the top 5 throughout Africa. And you need to connect major cities like Maputo to that hub for that hub to be effective. So you can't go wrong. Any hub connection of a major city to a major hub is a slam dunk for winner of the year. And I give that the advantage over the Egypt Air one, but that's not to say that it's doing better than the Egypt Air one. It's just to say that I think there was more science behind that, while Egypt Air was probably driven significantly by just wishing to stick a finger in someone's eye.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, really great. And yeah, special shout out for Embraer because they did actually provide my Christmas jumper that I'm wearing today as well. Yeah, thank you to the guys there. That was last year's Christmas gift, which was really
But not
nice.
the chicken. Not the chicken on your
Not
head.
that it's not a chicken. We need to ask our resident wildlife expert.
Is it a chicken or is it a turkey? Behramjee, what's your view?
Looks like a chicken hen.
All right, let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move on. Okay. Anyway, let's go to something that's a little bit niche. So once, as you guys out there can have some sympathy for me, as I said, let's come up with some sort of linear, obvious awards. Then, of course, they get mutated slightly by our commentators that want to do some niche ones as well. So the next one is Best Intercontinental Expansion Route, which obviously is different to the Best New International Route. This is one where the frequencies have been increased. Okay, Behramjee, I think it's your turn to go first. So over to you.
Well, let Sean go first on this one.
Oh, he's passing the
Okay.
baton to you, Sean.
All right. Mine is actually something that I was waiting and hoping for them to actually announce. And now that they've announced it in the last few days, I can finally mention it. Kenya Airways to London Gatwick. This is a route that, even though Gatwick is a new station, Kenya Airways to London is a route that they've served forever. It's been a critical route for them. And again, as we discussed here with Martin earlier this year, as I've discussed every month with Martin after I send him a link to our discussion, like, how's your London things going? It is a market which is huge. It is a market that British Airways is growing in. They're adding a second daily flight in on some days of the week, in addition to their daily A350 1000. And Kenya Airways has consistently struggled to get enough slots to operate more than just their basic London daily service. They've had them in the past. They've sold them off. They've been able to get ad hoc slots here and there, but never had enough ability to get slots for a double daily service. They've also struggled with having enough lift. They simply did not have enough wide-body aircraft to service the entire schedule that they wanted to serve. And so that's why they brought in high-fly A330s on wet lease. In fact, those are operating their London service now through to the middle of January just for the extra capacity. Those are actually pretty nice aircraft, by the way. They're former South African Airways A330, so they have a really good business class product and a fairly decent product and economy. I've spent many hours on those shuttling between Ghana and South Africa in the past. But yes, but anyway, yeah. So Kenya Airways will be expanding their London operations into Gatwick as well from next year. And initially, it's just small; it's 3 times a week. But I think doing that, and I think the willingness of KQ to follow a trend, because there are a lot of airlines who wanted to increase London capacity, and rather than spend the humongous amounts of money that one needs to buy Heathrow slots on the open market, they're realizing that Gatwick, if you're reliant on O&D traffic, Gatwick does not really make a significant difference over Heathrow in terms of what kind of market you can draw. If you're leaving from the London area, if you're leaving from the UK in general, people are just as likely to want to use Gatwick as they are from Heathrow. And the yields in economy class are not that significantly different either. Heathrow has its advantage in terms of the business traffic it brings and of the connecting interline traffic it brings, but KQ is already flying to Heathrow. So adding these Gatwick services allows them to not surrender their share of the Kenya to East Africa market. The flight timings are such that they're going to arrive and depart from Nairobi right in time for their East African banks. They'll have connections to Mombasa's, Entebbe's, Zanzibar's, Dar es Salaam's, Kigali's, and the like. So it's very clear which markets they're targeting from the UK to this, and that their connections are going to be at the East African end rather than at the UK end, given that Gatwick's connectivity to markets that traditionally might happen from the UK is minimal. Then there isn't any real SkyTeam partner flying transatlantic from Gatwick anymore to anywhere. Even Delta is has cut back. I don't even think they're operating next summer the Gatwick JFK that they ran in the past. So I think it's a best intercontinental expansion route for me. It's one that's very new, one we haven't analyzed in a primary scenario, but it's one that we've discussed that market, the Nairobi to London market in general. And I think KQ's way of approaching this has been something that deserves a chapeau to them, even though this is a Christmas tree.
Yeah, very good, very good. Is it a Christmas tree? That is a question, actually, Sean. People
Is it a Christmas
may
tree?
debate it.
Yes, it is.
Oh dear, he's
Thank
let me
you.
down. Okay, that's fine. No, I think the point that you made, number one, I don't know whether Behramjee will say you've bent the rules here, because obviously it's not the same airport
Yes.
that they're flying to.
No.
So he might say that, but
It's not a 2024 expansion.
yeah, but it was announced this year. So I think,
Come on.
yeah, I think the announcement it probably does count, but we didn't set the
Okay.
parameters quite right. The only thing I was going to say before we come to Behramjee,
He's saying that because you called it a chicken. If you'd called it a turkey, he'd have sided with you.
I would have let you off. I would have sent Sean off. It'd just be me and you doing the podcast now. No, I was just going to say a special word for West African Connectivity Airport of the year would be Gatwick's done loads in terms of Ethiopian and obviously KQ, and there's talks with Uganda Airlines, which we talk about all the time. Obviously, they've got Norse to Cape Town, exactly. There's so much. So Stephanie and the team doing the route development, who I've known for many years down there in Gatwick, it's great. Yeah. And of course, Lagos and everything. So it's really been an interesting market. And I think we've covered it to to a great extent as well on the podcast over the year as well. Okay, Behramjee, over to you. Now Sean has shown his hand. Now you can show yours.
So I would say my favored expansion for Intercontinental out of Africa this year was actually Toronto, both for Egypt Air and Ethiopian Airlines, who were granted bilateral increases from 5 weekly to daily flights, which was much needed for the Toronto market because the amount of immigration, rapid immigration, I would say, from Africa to Canada, as well as tourism from Canada to Africa and VFR traffic going back and forth. This was needed for a long time. It was lobbied by Ethiopian in particular for a few years. Egypt Air used to operate extra flights during the summer peak season into Toronto. But this year, both airlines have been granted incremental bilateral increases on a permanent basis. So now Egypt Air flies a daily 787 / 777-300, depending on the seasonal demand trends, into Toronto, whereas Ethiopian Airlines flies a daily A350-900. Both of them see very high load factors. Ethiopian sometimes on a directionally basis. The main advantage that Egypt Air has versus Ethiopian for their Toronto flight is the location of the Cairo hub, where because Egypt Air can also tap into GCC and Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon type traffic, as well as India. Whereas Ethiopian mainly focuses on East Africa, Southern Africa, and Nigeria. Nigeria is the number one OND on the Toronto route. So each carrier has their fair pros and cons in terms of connectivity options via their hubs. But the bottom line is it was desperately needed. Desperately needed. Demand was more than supply overall. The main people who are suffering due to them being increased are the European carriers, as well as few American carriers. Their market share must have definitely dropped a little bit with more traffic going to Egypt Air and Ethiopian. But at the end of the day, demand dictates, and the Canadian government finally had the foresight and the willingness to grant both these carriers because they've also been operating a lot of flights over the years. So they've not been cribbing and crying like the Gulf years have been over here that they want immediately daily flights. They've earned their keep, and now hopefully they should make good money flying it.
You're absolutely right that these are slam dunk routes. But let me just make one comment on this, because I think this puts it into context. Both those routes saw effectively a 20 to 40% increase in capacity. So definitely they are good expansion routes. But the market, if you look in terms of the last 5 years, so 2019 to 2024, the market has grown between Africa and Canada significantly more than 40%. So this is not even making steps forward. This is failing to keep up with the growth in demand. It's not something that I've been very critical of the Canadians. I've had Air Canada contact me and tell me that I'm being harsh on them, but you know what? I am being harsh on them because they're taking actions. They're not taking actions. I think that's the problem. I think that the market between Canada and Africa is humongous. The market between Canada and Africa is growing. Africa is actually where the largest growth of any continent from Canada is happening. And yet the number of non-stop flights between Canada and sub-Saharan Africa stands exactly where it has since time immemorial at a grand total of 0. And that really needs to change. And the Canadian government's position in terms that, they don't have bilateral agreements with sub-Saharan African countries, that's not because sub-Saharan African countries don't want to. It's because the Canadian side has not prioritized it. Now, whether they're doing that because it's of a priority, whether they're doing that just simply to protect revenues for connecting traffic over Europe, which of course they're one of their major carriers, Air Canada, benefits through their transatlantic joint venture agreements. I don't know. But despite the fact that there has been a significant increase of traffic between Africa and Canada, that 40% is nowhere near enough. That market could have easily absorbed double the capacity. And I promise you, if tomorrow Ethiopian gets more rights to Canada, you would see Montreal via Abidjan open within 3 weeks, and they would probably sell it out on day one. And that is just the reality of the market. West Africa, whether that's Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, wherever, that is where the real growth of market is coming into Canada. And if Air Canada has said they want to serve that market in due course, we've covered that earlier this year. They've said it to me directly as well as publicly. It's going to happen sooner rather than later. Maybe 25 will be the year we finally get that announcement from Air Canada that they'll be commencing service between Montreal and Dakar. Probably would be their first route or something similar.
Interesting. Okay. So yeah, thank you for that. Now, I think there's been a lot of agreement on the podcast, apart from with my headgear, but everything else you guys seem to have agreed with each other. Now I'm going to you, Behramjee, for this one, because you passed the buck last time, which is worst route decision of the year. Now, we like to be positive on this and we like to make it informative and fair and all the rest of it, but we felt there had to be a category for the worst decision. And over to you, Behramjee, to break the news to the poor airline.
I would say the worst route decision commercially of the year, unfortunately, and with all due respect, has to go to Ethiopian Airlines for starting and believing and thinking that Dhaka could be operated on a reasonable commercial basis 6 times a week using a 787 nonstop. It had no justification whatsoever from any angle. And they have seen it. The flights now to and from Dhaka, Bangladesh, are now reduced to a 737 MAX 8 from January 5th, which is in their 3rd month of flying. Once again, a lot of things that we have discussed
been reduced
and
from 6 to
forecasted
5
on this, and also reduced from 6 to 5. So even more so. A lot of things that we have discussed on this podcast, I would say majority of our predictions have come true. But also the second worst decision, which thankfully was not implemented, was what I had forecasted a few months ago, and it ended up being right, was Ethiopian were launching their second daily Dakar flight in Senegal via Bamako, which was announced during the early summer to start from the winter season. And thankfully, it never got operated because the demand just wasn't there. So I'm sorry, but sometimes we have to be very clear and very abrupt. But obviously, airlines make mistakes. No airline is perfect. But it didn't make any justification to me, to Sean, to Jon also, commercially speaking, to fly Dhaka, Bangladesh with a wide body from the onset. And that too on an almost daily basis. The Dhaka Africa market is not that big at all. When I flew, by the way, Ethiopian Airlines last month to Bangkok from Douala, I saw a lot of Dhaka passengers in transit, but they were all going to Riyadh and Jeddah. That is not what the intention of the flight should be. The intention of any Ethiopian airline new route should be first focusing on Africa connectivity, not backtracking to a market which sees multiple one-stop and non-stop connections on offer. Yes, Dhaka, Jeddah is now 1 million passengers point to point, but that should not be the focus of Ethiopian because they must be dumping fares on their route to capture some market share. Yeah,
I think that's good reasoning, and you've been proved right. So Dhaka and Dakar, that obviously the Ethiopian flight was Bangladesh that we were talking about, right? Sure. And I saw you were surprised with Ethiopian, then you were nodding when you heard the route, thoughts, and then your nomination.
I can't disagree with either of those significantly. I think the Dakar is a positive. You reach a point in any network expansion where the numbers on paper pretty much have told you everything that they can. You've exhausted every route that makes sense, but you still need to grow. And consequently, you take chances. You take chances by announcing new routes, and if they don't work out in pre-sale, you back off on them. So I'll give Ethiopian credit for that, for the Dakar one. They tried it. I think they could have probably made it work, but they couldn't have made it work given their scheduling restrictions. If they could have flown that second flight with the MAX 8, they could probably have made it work. But because that aircraft has to turn around to come back to the main hub bank, it wouldn't work. But I still think that the MAX 8 may come into Dakar as a second hub, whether it's a third bank route or something else. I think we may see that in 2025. Because, and here I think is where we link it into the other route, which is Dhaka. And the one positive which has come out of the Dhaka route, and certainly it has been a complete mess. It was launched at exactly the wrong time, right when Bangladesh demand cratered with all the civil unrest over there and everything else going wrong. The 787 was scheduled because of cargo demand. Cargo demand in Bangladesh is stalling because so many of the factories, the garment factories and things like that, are not operating at full capacity because of strikes and demonstrations and stuff like that. So it was launched at exactly the wrong time. The wide body didn't make sense anymore because cargo had dropped. It was just a mess. But the one good thing that's come out of it is Ethiopian has been able to prove that 737 MAX of theirs is capable of doing those long legs. That is 8 hours almost from to Addis going westbound. I mean, looking at how long these flights, and the longest flight has been 7 hours and 51 minutes on a 737 MAX, which is a really long haul operation. And I think just having that in mind shows that there is a possibility, certainly not right now with some of the airspace restrictions, the inability to fly fully over Sudan and so forth. But in due course, that might actually open up the ability of that MAX to be able to go from Addis to Dakar. And I think at that point of time, a second daily to Dakar is it's something that has to be done. Right now, Dakar's schedule is a big hole in Ethiopian's network because it simply does not connect to every flight on the bank. And they really would want to do it, but there's no way. They don't have. It's too small a market for a second daily wide body, and it's too far a market for a narrow body, given the current restrictions. So yeah, I understand why both those decisions were there. And I can understand why, sitting at the end of the year, in retrospect, we can say, yeah, those probably weren't what they could have done smartly.
So your nomination?
My nomination was the easiest decision I took all year. When this route was announced, I scratched my head. When I went back through the list of new routes for the year, when we were prepping for this show, I was just like, there is this route, and then there's everything else. And that is, what would a show be without me saying something about our friends at Air Tanzania? Dubai to Zanzibar, one way on Air Tanzania, because they now have nonstop flights between Dubai and Zanzibar, flights between Zanzibar and Dubai. Why? I still haven't made sense. What even makes less sense is the fact that they advertise this. Fly from Dubai to Zanzibar. From Zanzibar to Dubai.
Mhm.
You know what? They started this flight with a 737-900. It's already like 4 weeks into it, downgraded to an A220. So I was just looking in the GDS at this. The flight is now an A220. No clue what they're trying to achieve with this.
I thought all the A220s were grounded.
Who knows? Genuinely, with Air Tanzania, who knows? This is not an airline that makes logical decisions. This is the least logical in a long chain of illogical decisions. And when I had to pick the worst route of the year, there was this route. Nothing else even came close. I was very worried that you'd pick it as well, because I did not have a second place. I did not have a number 2 route for this one. There's that route, and there's no other route. That is the dumbest decision taken by any route planner in Africa in the year 2024.
Okay. All right. Very good. On that note, let's move
Behramjee, your
swiftly on.
comments?
Yeah. Do you want to comment on that, Behramjee?
I was not expecting Sean to nominate that route because it was a triangle service. But yes,
That's
it
not a
doesn't.
triangle service. It's not a triangle service. Look at the
Meaning-
schedule. There's no triangle
Meaning-
service. You have a 6-hour layover.
No, meaning one way does not connect in the other direction of for Zanzibar. But anyways, I agree that the routing of Dubai for Air Tanzania, they unfortunately messed it up from day one. It's sad. They have a lot of potential if they really put their mind to it. At least they, as Sean said, they downgraded to 220, which I'm surprised are flying for them because I thought they were grounded. So at least they're saving money that way. But I just hope the TO, some good decisions are taken commercially and some network revamp gets done because they really do have potential if they really put their mind to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tanzania as a country is doing really well in terms of its growth and its opportunities and its ambitions. And the airline's got some new aircraft, but as we've said, there is a new CEO at the helm, and who knows? We'll see how this looks in 2025 for sure. Let's move to the next one because we have got a couple left. So the next one is route suspension of the year. Sean, you're going to kick us off with that one.
I think he might have the same one as me
Okay.
in this one.
We might actually have the same one on this one, and we're going to go earlier in the year for this one. It's a route that, that started off with many big plans and much fanfare, and then slowly was downgraded. Frequencies were cut, tech stops were added, and eventually it just died a slow death. And that was from one of and I'm giving them credit here for the best route suspension of the year, was our friends at Rwandair and their flight to Mumbai.
Yes,
this was the route that started off with their A330 to Mumbai. It was intended to have fifth freedom rights onward to Gwangju, which pre-COVID would have been wonderful. First non-stop flight in Mumbai and Gwangju, except it never actually launched. And they were stuck flying an A330 to Mumbai on a market that simply could not support it. They were running short on A330 capacity, so they wound up having to put that in 737. The 737 had payload restrictions. They were doing tech stops in Mombasa. Then they started doing tech stops in Entebbe. Then everybody else began flying into the market. Uganda Airlines, Air Tanzania, all their neighbors, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. Indigo started flying to Nairobi, taking away their largest O&D in East Africa as well. It was a small pie to begin with. They had the wrong cutlery to cut the pie, and then that pie began to shrink as well. And eventually you reach a point where rather than fighting for those crumbs from the table, you just got to say, screw the pie, we're going to have chicken instead. And I think that is what they did. They said, enough of that Mumbai route, our resources. I'll give you Rwandair credit, because in 2024, you have not seen me rant as much about Rwandair as usual, because in 2024, and I think part of this may be due to their new chief commercial officer, Fuad, he's come in recently, but even prior to that, Rwandair has been taking decisions which have been relatively commercially sensible. Even the suspension of their Cape Town flights have not been necessarily a bad idea as far as things go. But as far as an obvious best route suspension of the year, Rwandair to Mumbai, far and away above any other route suspension that I've seen in 2024. It made sense for them, and I sincerely hope they continue evaluating their network and not throwing good money after bad.
Behramjee, you agree?
So, 100% agree. It was actually one of my nominations, but I always kept backup just in case Sean and I conflicted. So, my favorite suspension of the year is also Mumbai, but Airpeace suspended Mumbai this year.
Yeah. But have they suspended it? They still pretend that they're operating it, even though no plane has landed there in 8 months. It's still on their route map.
I think the last flight was in March or April.
Yeah. So no plane has flown there in 8 months, but they haven't said they've suspended it. They just quietly faded away into nothingness.
Yeah, they initially started the route twice a week with the 777s. Then they reduced within few months to once a week. And it went on flying once a week, offering $400 one-way fares or $700 one-way fares with all taxes inclusive. And eventually that route fizzled out once Jeddah and London came online. And thank God for that, because it was basically like a ad hoc charter service flying once a week. God knows.
Yeah, they didn't even fly every week. Sometimes they just skip a few weeks in the middle and then suddenly just show up at a completely different time. They'd be scheduled to land at 9 in the morning and they'll show up at 4 in the afternoon, 3 weeks off schedule.
Yeah.
And you just, I mean, seriously, when people say, wow, he said good things about Airpeace, that's not going to last. They said good things about Airpeace on one route. Okay. Every other route they fly, with maybe the exception of Kano to Jeddah, which I'll grant Behramjee that one. But with the exception of London and Jeddah, Airpeace has made a complete shambles of every other thing that they have touched. And Mumbai, perfect example of it. But I won't put it as best route suspension of the year. It was the stupidest route. It's not even the stupidest route to start. It's a route with potential. It's just that the way they did it was just,
Yeah. And also,
and this is the way it works, right? You've got to try things, you've got all the data, you throw it in the market. There are winners, there are losers, but I think you have very limited sympathy here, Sean, which is coming through, I think.
You know what? You say that you should try things, but there are also things you must understand your limitations. If you're a very good fish, you might be the tastiest fish in the sea, but you don't try to climb a tree. And if you're a bird, you don't try swimming underwater. You know what your place is, what you're good at doing, and you try to do. Because when a fish tries to climb a tree, the fish drowns. He drowns outside of water. And that's what Airpeace does in pretty much every market they do. They drown outside the water because it's that remarkable how they can turn even the most obvious success stories into complete rubbish.
Okay, fantastic. Go on, Behramjee.
People will be surprised to know that Mumbai to Lagos is actually a longer flight than Lagos to JFK. Just an FYI for our listeners. Yeah. So
It's
the risk,
it's a very long route, and it's a route with a lot of passengers. I think it's 50,000 plus, if I'm not mistaken.
61,000 last year.
This is a route that is actually have a justification for direct service. If you, I think it's the third or fourth largest mainland Africa route from India overall, after Nairobi, Johannesburg, and a couple of others. So there's definitely a market there, but there's not a market for Airpeace because Airpeace does not know how to market flights other than in markets where, as I said, it took more work to screw it up. And thankfully for them, they didn't put that much work in and didn't screw up their London route. So Airpeace, congratulations to them on suspending that route, even though they haven't officially announced that they're suspending it. And if they do actually announce they're suspending it, I'm sure they'll blame the war in Sudan or something to do with pilgrims in Syria, or I don't know, because it's never their fault. It's always an excuse.
Okay, two to go, guys. So we are now going to move to surprise route of the year. So the one that when you heard about it, when we shared it on our internal WhatsApp group, which is always buzzing with new announcements, that you went, oh, I didn't see that one coming. Whose turn is it to kick off this time? I've lost track now. Who wants to go? Come on, be brave. Behramjee's going. Here we go.
I would say Royal Air Maroc to Toronto. That no one...
You had to get that one in again.
It was a complete surprise. It was not mentioned on any internal airline forum. There was no rumor. There was no... It was a very well-kept secret, I would say. There was no talk about the Canada-Morocco bilateral also being increased in terms of rumor online on many of our favorite airline forum websites. And it just came out of left field. But again, it is a route which is desperately needed for the African continent. Casablanca has a good hub positioning for that route to connect sub-Saharan Africa. The only problem is all the North American flights of Royal Air Maroc require a 10-hour transit from North America to Africa. But they compensate that by offering Southern Europe connections via Casablanca to Spain, Portugal, France, etc. But that's not the primary aim. What I was talking about, Ethiopian Airlines and Dhaka, Jeddah, yeah, that route definitely surprised me in a good way. It's very convenient for me to fly into Toronto from Cameroon. But actually, to be frank with you, due to the transit times involved, it is overall faster for me to still fly SN Brussels with Air Canada via Brussels from Douala to Toronto whenever Air Canada restarts their summer seasonal Brussels-Toronto flights. And that's mainly because of the long transit in Casablanca. So
meets the criteria, and we now know about your personal travel agendas as well, which is good. So yeah, Sean, over to you. Which one?
I think for me, there's only one real blatantly obvious one. It's already cost me $20, and it's going to be AirAsia to Nairobi. I did not see this one coming. Even when it was announced, I did not see this coming. Even now that it has been launched, I still do not see why it is continuing to run. I've seen videos from influencers who have been on board these empty planes, and I still do not understand why this route is there and why they think it's going to be continuing a success. I'm optimistic. I wish them well. I think it would be a great route if it were successful. I do not see it being successful. I'm surprised they have persisted, and I would be very surprised still to see this. If this route is still running at the end of 2025, when we do this wrap up at the end of next year, it will be once again in my surprise route of the year that this route is still going strong, because I cannot see how 4 times a week, A330-300s from Kuala Lumpur to Nairobi, even with AirAsia's humongous network behind it, can ever make sense. It is too much capacity in a market that is resistant to stimulus simply because of the nature of what the traffic is. It can be stimulated only up to a point and not enough, not the 50 and 60-fold stimulation that this market would need to make sense.
It's tough for
That's my
travel
surprise
agents
of
to
the
sell
year.
them. Also, it's tough for travel agents to sell
Yeah,
them.
but it's getting better.
Media has
It's getting better.
incentive.
They've leveraged that now. They're in GDS
Okay, good.
through the H1 code and the
Mm.
thing. So they're in that now.
Yeah, but that
But
is
it's limited. It's a
Yeah.
backdoor way of doing things. And yeah, let's see. To me, no matter how you distribute, the distribution will take it from borderline bad to borderline good, but it's never going to take it for, I do not understand this, to, oh my God, that made sense. And we're still very much in the, I do not understand this, $20 notwithstanding.
Well, $20, that could get you a fare on some of the, and those initial kickoff
Well, yeah,
fares,
I mean,
think
the
was
base
zero,
fare is even
wasn't it?
lower than that. Yeah, the base
Yeah.
fare is
But I think-
zero. So $20 could have got me quite a lot of trips.
Yeah, I think, look, from my side, and I don't like to weigh in on these things. Obviously, I was involved in the conversations. We did have the CCO on the podcast before launch. We helped with the entry into service. And I think the long haul, low cost to mainland Africa and opening up travel to people and business opportunities to people who ordinarily couldn't afford to do it. I'd love to see it succeed without having a particular relationship with one carrier or another. I just think it would be great to see this kind of, this is a natural evolution. Is it too early? Maybe. And all those other questions that come in, but good on AirAsia. And Tony Fernandez, I think personally was actually, from what I heard, he personally was pushing, we want to get into Africa. We want to show that we can extend this network with their A330s. So yeah, of course, from my side, I want all the, and we all do, we all want the routes to succeed. It's just that your jobs is to try and work out whether it will and whether it won't and whether it had a chance in the first place. So no, I appreciate that. We're going to come to our, I've done yours. Yeah. Go on, Behramjee, carry on.
To add to what Sean was saying, Sean thinks that the route might be there in winter 2025. I would be surprised if this route survives even the onset of summer 2025. It should not be
Completely
flying.
agree. I will be surprised if it's still there. If it's still running in winter 2025, it will be my surprise route of the year for 2025 also.
Like if this route
There we
runs
go.
for
$20, Sean, $20 for charity.
$20 again. And I get my 20 back if
Oh,
the
no, don't
charities
start
don't
changing the
pay me.
rules.
I don't
Oh
see
dear, you heard that. You heard that here. He wants money from the charity.
I don't see this route lasting beyond May 2025. The losses will be
Okay.
Too high.
Okay, we will see, because of course the podcast will endure into 2025, of course. Final, we want to end on a positive note. So we're going to go to our final award. Now, this one's a little bit nebulous, but we will explain it. So it's the most sensible commercial decision of the year. Now, that could be a new service, a suspension, a frequency increase, a frequency decrease, a fleet decision. It's pretty open. So therefore, it should be pretty interesting to see what the guys come up with. I think if you come up with the same thing, I'll be surprised. Sean, you go first, because Behramjee went first last time. Go.
Okay. Mine is something that if you follow the podcast through the year, I have spoken about many times, and I'm going to go a little bit into a bit more of a deep dive today. And that is Ethiopian's expansion of their third bank flying. I think this has been something where Ethiopian is a very well-structured hub carrier. They've got very clearly defined hub banks where, for example, their morning flights depart from Addis to Africa between 8 and 10 a.m. They come back between 7 and 9 p.m. Then the evening back goes off to Europe and North America and India and everything else. What Ethiopian has struggled with in 2024 has been the fact that their aircraft deliveries that they were counting on for their expansion were not able to deliver at the rate that they were expecting them in 2024. Consequently, a lot of their plans in terms of markets they wanted to increase capacity into, as well as new markets they wanted to serve, became very difficult to serve without these new aircraft. He took an internal decision earlier in 2024 that their growth this year was largely going to come from better utility of aircraft. And by better utility of aircraft, it basically means flying more with the same number of planes. And the way ET has been able to do this is by growing what we call the third bank. The third bank is the afternoon bank between, say, 1 to 4 p.m. Primarily, there's a couple of flights outside of that bank, like the 6:30 p.m. departure to Mumbai. But that third bank operation effectively allows Ethiopian to hit markets off bank. So to fly to markets outside of the traditional morning to Africa, evening long haul, and to ensure that planes, which in some cases would sit entire days at their destination airport. So, for example, Chennai in India, the flight used to arrive there at 7 o'clock in the morning and the aircraft would sit there until 4 o'clock the next morning. So 21 hours on ground. What Ethiopian did was they used to fly 3 times a week with that schedule. Instead of doing that, they now increased their utility to 4 times a week, but turned that flight around immediately on landing in Chennai so that it came back and fed that third bank in Addis Ababa. Now, the third bank has a limited number of markets so far. It still only serves Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Zanzibar, Johannesburg, and a few other markets there. But by doing that, they were able to get a 4th weekly rotation instead of 3, and by using the plane 40% less. So the volume of aircraft they needed reduced by 40%, while their capacity went up by 30%. And that is just, I know it's very hard to explain over audio and on a podcast here. But the reality is, for those people who listen to this, who've studied aviation management and have studied operations theory and the mathematical aspects of it, this is a brilliant textbook example of how you can deploy your assets better. And fleet planning is not just about looking at which the network and fleet planning, which go together, isn't just about looking at a list of these are the top markets and picking. It's how to utilize your assets best, not just to serve the markets, but to serve them efficiently and to create connectivity between them. And the way that Ethiopian has built that third bank, and it's not just Chennai, it is Rome. They've just started this week. They've just started their daytime flights from Rome over the last weekend, where those flights are coming in. And those are timed on specific days of the week and time of day where they're going to connect to the beach destinations, which are humongous over the weekends with Italian tour operators and so forth. It is just, there's so many moving pieces which have just come together. And I genuinely, I wouldn't say this is just in Africa. I would say that if there was a global decision for most sensible and remarkable and logical commercial decision of the year, it is going to be how Ethiopian Airlines in 2024 has maintained excellent levels of growth and has maintained those levels of growth without taking a fraction of the number of planes that they had hoped to take during the year. So absolute kudos to Ethiopian. What they have done this year deserves applause, deserves congratulations, deserves every accolade and more.
Amazing. Wow. Great explanation as well. And there's loads on the previous editions where they've talked about some of the changes that have happened as well. Yeah, I think that is a really solid nomination. Behramjee, over to you.
I have actually 2 nominations, one of each type. One is a fleet and one is a route thing. The fleet one will surprise all of you all, but it's something very close and dear to me in terms of fleet standardization. Sean will start laughing when I say this, though he doesn't know what I'm going to say. It is Air Algeria finally realizing that it was useless, pointless, and senseless ordering 2 A350-1000s and exchanging them for 2 more A330-900 Neos, thus standardizing their future long-haul fleet to A330-900 Neos. In 2023, the airline surprised all of us by placing a new wide-body and narrow-body order to revitalize their fleet for the next 15 years. And everybody in the aviation world was surprised with their order for 2 A350-1000s in addition to 7 A330-900 Neos, because it made no sense for them to operate an almost 400-seater aircraft on any route, literally. And they've currently got a fleet of A330-200s flying intercontinental flights as well as to Europe. And the best thing was to transition to the bigger A330-900 Neo. Who and what made them think about the 350-1000 is beyond me. further complexes their fleet planning by having just two A350-1000, and thankfully, calmer and cooler heads prevailed, and they decided just a couple of months ago, as reported in the media, to exchange those two A350-1000s to A330-900s. That, I would say, was my best commercial fleet decision of the year. Now, in terms of network, now this Sean can relate to very well as you, John, and it has actually surprised all three of us this year, was the improved operational profitability and performance of Kenya Airways' New York JFK flights. When they started the route 5-6 years ago, it was a very big loss maker. And ever since they introduced the Delta code share this year, the route has done wonders for them, touch wood. The load factor has increased, but more importantly, the yields have also increased. We were told by the Martin earlier on this year that the route is now finally exceeding operational profit levels. And that has been largely helped by the support that Delta is giving them on this flight. And which has been evident with the fact that now they are flying on a permanent basis, a daily operation. Previously, it used to be 5 times a week permanently and sometimes reduced to 4 times during counter-seasonal periods. But now in the peak summer period and the peak winter period, they're actually flying 9 to 10 times a week. And that was their highest risk route because it was 14 hours nonstop. It had the biggest cash burn. But touch wood, now with Delta and SkyTeam supporting them on this route, things have turned around, and kudos to them, because it's not easy for an African carrier, especially flying ultra long haul, using a small 787-8 like KQ is doing, to turn around such a route. And New York is not, just because they have a monopoly on this route, which has 75,000 point-to-point passengers. There are multiple one-stop operators from Europe and Africa, which also take traffic. But KQ Touchwood has turned this route around, and I give them full credit. Hopefully, they also made a net profit this year for the first half, and hopefully this should carry on for their next future expansion. As their CEO stated previously, they're looking into flights into Washington, D.C., which is a higher yielding market for them. And the point-to-point market is also there, about 45,000 passengers, which can be stimulated further. I really am happy to see how Kenya Airways, being the carrier that it was a few years ago, even last year, have turned this route around. Full kudos to them.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember when that was announced and launched and the conjecture around it. And yeah, it's something that's gone under the radar. Go on, Sean.
I think that's a good example. I think that could actually qualify also for the best intercontinental expansion of the year. It was one that I had considered. It was actually between my KQ Gatwick. If the KQ Gatwick had not actually been announced, KQ's JFK would have been my choice. So I think it's a compliment to KQ. And they've been one of the good news stories of the year. Arguably, South African Airways has also been the good news stories of the year because they also claim to have made money, although I'm more likely to believe KQ's accounts than I am to believe SAA's accounts. Kudos to both of them. They both had very, very difficult times over the last decade or so. And even if it doesn't necessarily work, both of them seem to be working to some sort of plan. Now, SAA's plan is not one I necessarily agree with. Is one that I'm completely bought into. And I think this is just one of many results we hopefully will see from KQ in 2025. And hopefully we'll be able to get someone from KQ back to join us early in the year to discuss what their 2025 plans are. And even more, hopefully, we can get someone from SAA to join us. Even if I promise to actually be good, if TT or Prof decide to agree to come with us, or Emmanuel, I'll behave. I won't make snide comments. So I've said that publicly. If you want to invite them, I'd love to have them, and I'll be nice.
If they're listening where we are, we're an open book here. Please join in and reach out to me.
Oh,
the team will
They're
be
listening. They're listening. Hey guys, Merry Christmas.
Amazing. Yeah, that was really good fun and some really interesting outcomes. And it was good. There wasn't too much overlap from the two of you. I just want to say on behalf of all the listeners and on behalf of myself as well, you guys put so much into this podcast for the last year and plus. We've been doing this for over a year now, and it's a highlight of my month to get to sit down and listen to you guys. Obviously, there's a lot of preparation goes in behind the scenes, but we're all following this anyway. So it seemed like a natural kind of adaptation to bring it onto the podcast. And it's been a really fun thing. I get to learn every month. I know I get some good feedback from people out in the community as well. So I just want to say thanks to both of you for all the efforts that you put in.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, John.
The
There won't be
recommendations-
snow in Africa this Christmas, but we do know it's Christmas time at all.
Oh dear, oh dear. You should go enjoy your turkey. Sorry, mate.
Oh.
Watching once again. Is it a chicken? Is it a turkey? I think that's the big question this time. Yeah, it's been a real highlight this year. This is the last one for 2024. Of course, we didn't cover the new route announcements and everything. We'll save those up and cover those in a bumper January edition when we're all back. But yes, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for the series. As always, we'd love for more people to listen to this. So if you did enjoy it, hit the share button, share it with somebody in your network. It'll be the perfect Christmas present as they're winding down and they're doing their Christmas shopping. They can have this in their ears as they're doing that last minute shopping. Yeah, thank you all for joining us, and we will be back in the new year. And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and enjoy your time with your friends and family. Take care, and thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.